Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist from the United States. Formerly enslaved, he is one of the most important figures of Black history. Born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey to an enslaved mother and slave owner European father, he escaped slavery in September 1838 to the north of the USA, where he changed his name to Frederick Douglass and became one of the greatest abolitionists of all time. Douglass toured in Britain in the 1840s. During this time, he also toured Ireland, where he witnessed the conditions firsthand of the potato famine. In this video, I will talk about the circumstances that made Douglass visit Britain and Ireland, the areas he visited, and what he spoke about in his lectures. Douglass managed to escape slavery on his second attempt in 1838. In 1837, he met and fell in love with Anna Murray, a free Black woman from Baltimore, 5 years his senior. Her free status gave him confidence for him to escape, and Murray supported his efforts through aid and money. On September 3, 1838, he escaped successfully by boarding a northbound train in Baltimore. The couple settled in New Bradford, Massachusetts, a hub for formerly enslaved people, before moving to another area called Lynn in 1841. It was there when Frederick and Murray adopted Douglass as their married name. He grew his career by becoming a licensed preacher in 1839 in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which also included members Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. Douglass was also a steward, school superintendent, and sexton. He joined several organizations in New Bedford and attended abolitionist meetings. In 1845, he published his first book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The book became an instant bestseller. Although this posed a safety issue, the press would identify the public places he spoke, which led to Douglass being put in grave danger of immediate arrest as a fugitive slave. In fact, his owner, Thomas Auld of Maryland, announced that he wanted to capture Douglass into slavery. As a result, Douglass fled to Britain. In Britain, he was accompanied by leading American abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison in 1845 August. Douglass set sail for Liverpool and experienced racism during his journey to Britain. He boarded the Cunard steamship Cambria. Just before his trip had begun, he was met with pro-slavery advocates who argued against his boarding. They said that he should return back to slavery. In a letter to William Lloyd Garrison in September 1845, Douglass wrote, "From the moment we first lost sight of the American shore till we landed at Liverpool, our gallant steamship was the theatre of an almost constant discussion of the subject of slavery, commencing cool, but growing hotter every moment as it advanced. The truth was being told and having its legitimate effect on the ears of those who heard it. The slaveholders, convinced that reason, morality, common honesty, humanity, and Christianity were all against them, and that argument was no longer any means of defense. So they actually got up a mob, a real American Republican Democratic Christian mob, and that too on the deck of a British steamer. The pro-slavery supporters demanded he should return to his berth, and several decried that he should be sent back to slavery. Some even threatened to throw him into the ocean, but a noble-spirited Irish gentleman assured the man who proposed to throw me overboard that two could play at that game, and that in the end be thrown overboard himself. The clamour went on, waxing hotter and hotter, till it was quite impossible for me to proceed." This was different to the favourable treatment he would receive in Britain and Ireland. Frederick Douglass travelled to Ireland on his first tour of the British Isles. At the time, Ireland was under British occupation. He stayed with abolitionists across Ireland, visiting Belfast, Dublin, Limerick, and the Giant's Causeway. He connected with abolitionist organisations such as the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society, founded in 1837 by Richard Davis Webb, Richard Allen, and James Horton. Unlike British anti-slavery organisations, The Hibernian Society wanted slavery to be abolished immediately rather than a gradual process. Douglass also established a friendship with Daniel O'Connell, known as the Liberator, and was the earliest known Irish nationalist who campaigned for Catholic emancipation due to the British Protestant oppression of Catholics, which comprised and still comprises the majority of Ireland. On one occasion, Douglass shared a speaking platform with O'Connell, and O'Connell called Douglass the Black O'Connell, meaning that Daniel O'Connell saw Douglass also as a liberator. In a letter to William Lloyd Garrison, dating September 29, 1845, Douglass wrote, "Upon the subject of slavery in general and American slavery in particular, Mr. O'Connell grew warm and energetic. He said with an earnestness which I shall never forget, 'I have been assailed for attacking slavery. I am not ashamed of that attack. I am the foe of the tyrant. Wherever slavery rears its head, I am the enemy of the system or the institution. Call it by what you will. I am a friend of liberty. My sympathy with distress is not confined within the narrow bounds of my own green island." As a result, hundreds came to see Douglass speak, despite some Irishmen demanding him to be sent back to the USA. His presence was generally welcomed, not just by the ordinary man, but also upper-class men. He dined with the Lord Mayor of Dublin, who heard about his story. But Douglass was also horrified at the dreadful conditions of Irish people. You have to also realise that 1845 was the first year of the Irish potato famine, or the Great Famine, the worst famine in the history of Ireland, with a total of 1 million deaths and a further million emigrating. The Irish people heavily depended on potatoes, and potato crops became infected by blight, a fungus-like microorganism that infects potatoes and tomatoes. However, the wider cause of this famine was British agricultural policies and its emphasis on monoculture, which is the cultivation of a single crop in a given area, as opposed to a variety of crops being grown together. Due to the lack of minerals in the soil in monoculture, the practice makes it less immune to diseases and outbreaks, which is the reason why the potato famine happened. A more appropriate word to describe this event would be the Irish genocide. Douglass's next stop of his tour was Scotland in January 1846. In 1843, some ministers broke off with the Church of Scotland to form the Free Church of Scotland because they believed the state should not be involved in religious affairs. However, they landed in hot water when they got exposed for accepting £3,000 in donations from slaveholders from the USA. This is the equivalent of about £487,000 today. They were condemned as being unchristian by abolitionists, and a campaign called Send Back the Money was set up against them. Douglass got involved in this campaign and made this more aware nationwide. In a letter to William Lloyd Garrison, he wrote, "Scotland is ablaze of anti-slavery agitation. The Free Church and slavery are the all-engrossing topics. The Free Church is in a terrible stew. Its leaders thought to get the slaveholders' money and bring it home and escape censure. They had no idea that they would be followed and exposed. Its members are leaving it, like rats escaping from a sinking ship. There is a strong determination to have the slave money sent back, and the Union broken up. In this feeling, all religious denominations participate. Let slavery be hemmed in on every side by the moral and religious sentiments of mankind, and its death is certain." He lectured thousands of people in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Paisley, Dundee and Aberdeen about the campaign, which helped gain more awareness about the scandal. Songs were composed and the words "Send Back the Money" in caps were painted across buildings in numerous cities. Newspapers reported on this, backing Douglass's call, raising national debate. Due to the backlash, the Free Church was forced to respond. They stated that the church was against slavery and the abolitionists were too radical and heretical. Despite claiming they were against slavery, they still believed that not all slaveholders were evil and that it would be inappropriate to excommunicate slaveholders from congregations because this act would be insulting to those who helped the church. The church also called the phrase "send back the money" hypocritical because if this were followed through, it would become impossible to accept American cotton, rice, sugar and tobacco. The money was also never returned. Nevertheless, it did create debate over other organizations and slave fellowship. On August 4th, 1846, the World Temperance Convention was held in Covent Garden Theatre, London, and Douglass attended it. Temperance means teetotalism, and this was a popular movement with Christians, as many believed that alcohol was the cause of poverty, violence, and sin. Douglass was a strong believer in temperance and spoke in temperance societies and women's groups, and believed that alcohol endangered the black man's survival. Douglass spoke on the subject in the convention. However, not all were satisfied with his speech. Reverend Samuel Cox from Brooklyn began a public exchange with Douglass after the meeting, as he accused him of being paid by abolitionists to disrupt the convention. Although Cox was against slavery, he thought that Douglass turned the meeting into a debate about slavery. Speaking about Douglass, Cox said, "The moral scene was superb and glorious. When Frederick Douglass, the colored abolitionist agitator, came to the platform, he was perfectly indiscriminate in his severities. He talked of the American delegates and to them as if he had been our schoolmaster, and we his docile and devoted pupils, and launched his revengeful missiles against our country." Douglass refuted these accusations and stated that thousands of witnesses can attest if he were lying. He actually urged the convention to accept black people in temperance societies, as well as standing against slavery. Replying in a letter to Samuel Cox, he wrote, "Sir, you claim to be a Christian, a philanthropist, and an abolitionist. Were you truly entitled to any of these names, you would have been delighted at seeing one of Africa's despised children cordially received and warmly welcomed. This tells the whole story of your abolitionism and stamps your pretensions to abolition as brazen hypocrisy or self-deception. It must be said though, just because a white person was an abolitionist, it didn't mean that they were anti-racist, and this is reflected with Douglass's clashes with white abolitionists who patronized black lecturers like Douglass. Also, white abolitionists would use racist language to describe black lecturers or believing that they were incapable of making decisions. Therefore, when Douglass showcased his independence and challenged those who patronized, he was met with some dislike. When he was in Ireland, he was accompanied by Richard D. Webb, an Irish abolitionist who was also the publisher of his Autobiography, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. They would have frequent arguments, and Webb would frequently criticize Douglass. In a letter to abolitionist Maria Weston Chapman, he wrote, "He is, in my opinion, by much the least lovable and least easy of all the abolitionists with whom I have come into intimate association. I think his selfishness intense, his affections weak, and his unreasonableness quite extravagant when he is in the slightest degree hurt, or when he thinks himself hurt." Chapman also believed that Douglass was spoilt in Britain and had a large ego. To Webb, she wrote, "The cause has been nothing but good to Douglass, in a worldly point of view. While he has uncommon abilities of a practical and useful sort, I earnestly hope he may not yield to temptation. If Douglass can but keep from the temptation to get into his own house, as we call being drunk with vanity, because of the general attention that his powers, circumstances, and cause excite when united, he will not only do the cause great good, but receive and deserve a high place in the list of public benefactors. If his good sense prevail, all will go well." White abolitionists were threatened by the confidence and independence that a black lecturer had. Perhaps pity for the people they thought were inferior was the reason why some of these abolitionists were against slavery. There was still one more thing to do before Frederick could return to the United States, and it was to have his freedom, or he might have been recaptured when he arrived into the country. Whilst he was lecturing in Newcastle, he stayed with Anna Richardson and her sister-in-law, Ellen, in the Summer Hill Grove. The two women were Quaker abolitionists. As Frederick wanted to go back to the USA after touring all around Britain, Anna and Ellen raised funds towards the end of 1846 to pay a lawyer in America to buy his freedom. £150 or $700 at the time were raised. In due course, the Richardsons received confirmation from Douglas's enslaver. He said his slave Frederick Bailey, alias Douglas, was now entirely and legally free. On April 27, 1847, after returning to the US, Douglas wrote to Anna. He said, "I now have my manumission papers in my possession. I landed on your shores a slave and came back a free man." Douglas experienced racism on his trip back to the USA. He bought a first-class ticket to board on the Cunard steamship Cambria, yet he was refused entry into the first-class part and found that his place was given to someone else. Douglas was angered by this, and he wrote a letter to the press describing his treatment. He wrote, "A British bow to an American prejudice. Cunard's line of transatlantic steamers is, we believe, essentially British. The proprietors consequently have no right to outrage the feelings of Englishmen on board their vessels by the adoption of the vilest of American prejudices, nor if there, by the virtue in our country, men for which we give them credit, will they permitted to do so with impunity. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our coloured brethren, and we owe it to our principles to brand with reprobation, loud and universal, the stooping of British commerce to such unutterable meanness. Whatever may be tolerated in America, we do hope that the manly feeling of this country will frown down any disposition to introduce prejudice against colour into English company, whether ashore or abroad." This sparked a lot of controversy and discussion in Britain. Even songs and poems based on the incident were created. The papers wrote about the case of Frederick Douglass, and the man who refused Douglas's ticket finally responded through a public letter to the Times, justifying his actions. The backlash was so bad that Samuel Cunard, the owner of the ship, issued a public apology. This had never been done before, a white businessman apologizing to an African American and former slave. Douglass would become increasingly popular in American abolitionist circles as he toured and lectured around the country for 20 years until the Civil War. He set up an anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star in December 1848, and in 1955 he had his second autobiography published, My Bondage and My Freedom, and he reflected on his travels to Britain and Ireland. Douglas's presence in Britain and Ireland caused a lot of controversy and discussion, and so was his exit. He was supported by many people whilst he freely moved around the country, mainly in railway, as in railway tracks and lines were being built commercially. At the same time, some wanted him to go back to the USA and remain a slave. He challenged organizations such as the Free Church for taking slaveholder money, and even made white abolitionists uncomfortable as he stood confident, emphasizing his independence. Douglass was an intelligent and courageous man who inspired many and would continue his activism even after emancipation. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.